Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. The Dogmans Hollow, a horror story of an inherited cabin, the Hollow Howl Part I. The cabin's history: I inherited the cabin from my uncle, Raymond Carter, a man I barely knew. It sat on the edge of Michigan's northwestern woods, an old relic of timber and stone that had stood for nearly a century. I remembered visiting once as a child, but the memory was hazy, buried beneath the weight of years and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Uncle Raymond had lived alone in that cabin for decades, a recluse by all definitions. He had no wife, no children, and no real ties to the outside world. When he died, there was no funeral, just a yellowed legal notice arriving at my doorstep, informing me that I was now the sole owner of a place I had almost forgotten. The idea of solitude appealed to me. Life in the city had worn me down, and a few weeks in the quiet wilderness sounded like exactly what I needed. So in early October, I packed up my truck and made the long drive north. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the smell. The woods carried the crisp scent of autumn, wet leaves, distant pine, and the unmistakable musk of something else, something animal. I shook off the unease and unloaded my things, stepping inside to find the cabin just as Uncle Raymond had left it. Dust coated the wooden furniture, and the air held the stagnant weight of neglect. The only recent addition was a leather-bound journal sitting on the kitchen table. My uncle's handwriting filled its pages, neat but hurried, as if he had been documenting something important. I would read it later, I decided. First, I needed to settle in. Part Roman 2. The signs the first few nights were peaceful, if eerily quiet. The wind whispered through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl was the only thing breaking the silence. But by the fourth night, I began to notice things. It started with the scratching. At first, I dismissed it as the scurrying of raccoons or squirrels, the usual culprits of woodland noise. But the sound was persistent, clawing at the walls, slow and deliberate. When I went outside to check, flashlight in hand, there was nothing there. Then came the footprints. They appeared one morning just outside the front steps. At first glance, they looked like wolf tracks, large, padded imprints pressed deep into the damp earth. But something was off. The stride was wrong, the gait too long, and at the end of each print were what looked like elongated toes, tipped with claw marks. Wolves didn't walk like that. No animal did. I thought about Uncle Raymond's journal, still unopened on the table. That night, as the wind howled and the strange scratching returned, I finally flipped it open. Part Roman 3. The journal, the leather-bound journal, felt heavy in my hands, the pages yellowed with age but sturdy, as if they had been turned many times. Uncle Raymond's handwriting was neat and deliberate, though there was an urgency to it that only grew as I flipped through the pages. His entries seemed to span decades, as if he had been keeping this journal his entire life, but something about the more recent ones made my skin crawl. The first few entries were mundane, nothing more than a man's musings on nature and solitude. But as the months went on, the tone shifted. October 13, 1982, the forest feels different this year. It's colder. The trees seem to loom over the cabin, casting long, unnatural shadows even when the sun is high. There's a smell in the air, something animal. I know the local wildlife, but this is not them. It's a pungent musk that stings the back of my throat. I've heard scratching on the walls at night too. It's not raccoons, not squirrels. It's something bigger. I've tried to ignore it. November 2, 1982, I found tracks near the cabin this morning. Not the usual deer or foxes, but something else. Huge prints, deep and elongated, like a wolf's but wider, with claws at the tips. There was something else in them, too, scratches like something had scraped the ground beside each print. I don't know what this thing is. I've seen it, but only in glimpses. Just out of the corner of my eye. It's always watching. March 17, 1984, it's been 2 years, and I haven't spoken to a soul. But I know it's out there. It waits. I can hear it in the trees, pacing, moving just beyond the cabin's reach. It's not the wind. It's something far more deliberate. The scratching is getting louder now, closer to the door. Last night I saw it in the clearing, 2 glowing eyes, yellow and unblinking, staring at me from the shadows. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It's like it has some kind of power over me. It knows me. I'm trapped here. The cabin is my prison, and I'm not sure I'll make it through the winter. July 22, 1985. I'm not sure how many days have passed since I last wrote. There's a strange pull in the air, something almost magnetic, drawing me toward the woods. Every night it comes closer. The scratching, the breathing just outside the window. I've started to sleep with my rifle by my side, though I know it won't help. I've seen the way it moves, fast, silent, too fast to outrun. I don't know if I can escape, but the worst part, it knows my name. I swear it spoke my name tonight in the voice of my mother. It's not human. It can mimic voices, and it knows exactly what to say to hurt. I'm not safe here. No one is. I closed the journal with shaking hands, my heart pounding in my chest. Each word felt like a nail being driven into my skull, tightening the grip of fear around me. Uncle Raymond's paranoia was evident, and yet there was a deep truth to what he wrote, a truth I could no longer ignore. Something was out there, something that had been waiting for me. I glanced out the window, but the forest remained still, shrouded in darkness. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, if it was the weight of the journal's contents messing with my mind, or if the woods were truly alive with something unnatural. But the scratches had started again low, dragging across the side of the cabin. Part Roman 4. The unseen watcher the following days blurred together. Time seemed warped here, as if the cabin and the woods existed outside of it. I no longer felt the comforting weight of day and night. There was only the unsettling stretch of silence between the scratching and the occasional wind, carrying with it the faintest trace of the animalistic musk. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a fleeting thought. It was constant, pressing down on me like a heavy hand. The trees outside the cabin stood tall and motionless, but it was as though they were alive, each one hiding something, watching me with unseen eyes. I began to hear things, whispers, soft but unmistakable, just outside my window. They were too quiet to make out at first, but the more I listened, the more distinct they became. There were voices in the woods. Sometimes it sounded like children laughing. Other times it was a low growl, deep and guttural. And then there was the breathing. I heard it the first night I dared to sleep with the window open. Heavy, wet breaths, slow and deliberate. It came from just beyond the cabin, somewhere in the trees, and yet when I mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. Just the shadows stretching across the yard, twisted and unnatural in the moonlight. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or some animal lurking in the woods. But the longer I stayed, the more convinced I became that I wasn't just hearing things. Whatever it was intelligent. It knew exactly where I was at every moment. One evening, I went for a walk, unable to stay inside any longer. I needed to clear my head to escape the suffocating weight of the cabin. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The air felt thick, the trees leaning in toward me like a dark, oppressive crowd. My heart raced, my breath shallow as I quickened my pace, and then I saw it. At first it was a flicker in the corner of my eye, a flash of movement between the trees. But when I turned, there was nothing, just more woods stretching on forever. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I had to get back to the cabin. Part V. The encounter. The wind outside howled louder than it had in the past few days, rattling the windows and shaking the very foundations of the cabin. I had barely managed to drift off to sleep, the exhaustion from the constant paranoia beginning to weigh down on me. But then it came, the loud, echoing bang on the front door. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something had thrown itself against the cabin with a force that shook the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and for a moment I convinced myself it was just a bear, maybe a deer, maybe even a large tree branch knocked loose by the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The door rattled again, more violently this time. I threw the covers off and grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling. The beam of light flickered wildly as I moved toward the door, fear churning in my stomach. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence in between the slamming thuds making the room feel suffocatingly small. I had to open it. I had to see what was out there. When I turned the doorknob, It was as if the air itself thickened. A low growl, vibrating through the cabin's wooden floorboards, made my breath catch. I paused at the door, barely daring to peer through the crack between the frame and the door. The forest outside was dark, so dark that it swallowed up everything but the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. But in the distance, just on the edge of my vision, there was movement. Slow, deliberate movement. It came closer, and then it stepped into the dim light cast by the cabin's window. My stomach twisted violently as the creature emerged from the shadows. It was tall, taller than anything I'd ever seen, standing easily 7 feet or more. Its body was hulking and grotesque, covered in dark, matted fur that looked damp, as if it had just emerged from the swamp. The fur looked wrong, too thick, almost human-like in texture, but with a sinewy undercurrent that spoke of something far darker. Its legs were powerful, twisted with unnatural muscle, its shoulders broad and hunched forward in a way that made it appear more animal than human, but there was nothing natural about it. Its face, its face, was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. It was a grotesque mix of canine and something otherworldly. The elongated snout was twisted in a way that no natural animal's face could ever be, the nose wet and black, flaring as it sniffed the air. But what made it worse were its eyes. 2 glowing yellow orbs set deep into its skull, unmoving and yet watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. They were intelligent eyes, too intelligent, far beyond any animal's gaze. They saw me, and in that moment I felt exposed. I felt as though it could see into my very soul. I stood frozen in place. My body betrayed me. My muscles locked up, my breath caught in my throat. The creature took a slow step forward, its claws scraping against the floorboards of the porch. I tried to swallow, but the air had thickened, making it impossible to draw a steady breath. Its movements were calculated, deliberate, like a predator savoring the chase. It didn't lunge at me. It didn't attack. It simply watched. And that was what terrified me most, because I knew, deep down, that if it wanted to kill me, it could have done so in an instant. But it didn't. It knew me. I could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on me, as though it had been studying me for years, waiting for me to come back to this place. The realization crashed over me in waves. The Dogman, the creature in my uncle's journal, had been stalking this cabin, watching me, maybe even waiting for me, all along. And it wasn't just some mindless beast. It was aware. It was patient. It was ancient. The creature's lips curled slightly, exposing teeth that were too long, too sharp, and yet its posture remained relaxed, almost mockingly so. It was toying with me, and I realized then that it was not just a beast. It was a presence, a force that was beyond the natural world. It stepped closer. The moonlight bathed its form in cold, harsh light. The air smelled of wet fur, of decay, and something metallic. The stench of it overwhelmed me, choking me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then it spoke, or mimicked, something that shattered the fragile barrier between reality and nightmare. The voice that came from its mouth wasn't guttural like a growl, but human, disturbingly so. It was my own voice, but wrong. It rasped and echoed in the air, sounding hollow. Leave. Now it whispered, the sound of my name on its breath. My mind shattered, and I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the edge of the rug as I tripped and fell. My heart was pounding, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breath, ragged and desperate. The door was still open, the creature still standing there, its eyes never leaving me. The Dogman took a slow step forward, then another, and then it was gone, vanishing into the trees as swiftly as it had appeared. But I didn't close the door. I couldn't. I just sat there, shivering, my heart still in my throat, waiting for the next move. The fear didn't abate. If anything, it was growing stronger. Part VI. Aftermath the next morning came slowly, and I don't remember falling asleep. I don't even remember lying down. But when the sun finally broke through the trees, I found myself sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the open door, my body frozen in place. The night's terror had left me hollow, and the quiet outside felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, throwing things haphazardly into my bags, not even bothering to check if I had everything. I had to get out. The weight of the forest pressing in around me, the creature's eyes still burned in my mind. I could still hear its voice, whispering my name in the stillness of my thoughts. I slammed the truck door behind me, revved the engine, and drove. I drove until the woods were behind me, until the trees gave way to open fields and highway stretches. But even as the cabin faded in the rearview mirror, the feeling didn't leave. The dogman had marked me. I knew that now. And no matter how far I ran, it would be with me. The encounter wasn't just a brush with death. It was something far worse. It had touched me, changed me, and I could never go back to who I was before. The woods were still with me, in my skin, in my thoughts. I started seeing things. Shadows flickering just out of sight, a scent on the air that I couldn't place, but it was always there, heavy and pungent. I thought I saw it again at the edge of the road, in the reflection of my rearview mirror. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The dogman was following me, waiting. The cycle wasn't over. And deep down, I knew it never would be. I still hear its voice in my dreams, calling me back to the cabin. It's not over. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.